Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Mark Guerin and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. And we warmly welcome you to tonight's forum with a fascinating topic on technology, which has certainly been an ever-present part of all of our lives and in our society, with the undeniable benefits that exist with technological advancements. But we will also explore some of the other questions, the attendant questions of technology as well. Of those who may be profiting from the use of data, to the issue of surveillance capitalism, to the ethics and the accountability, to the monetization of personal data, and importantly, to the agenda for technology going into the next Congress and the next administration. So we have a rich conversation in store for us this evening, and we're very grateful to our colleagues at the Center for Business and Government to work with us in putting together this panel. We're fortunate to welcome Jim Steyer to tonight's forum, who's a civil rights attorney and a children's advocate and author and professor, who's written an important book entitled Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. We also welcome to the forum Ellen Pao, the CEO of Project Include and the former CEO of Reddit, and Shoshana Zuboff, who's a professor emerita at the Harvard Business School and the author of the important book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. These experts, drawing upon their experiences and their scholarship and their writing, will be in conversation moderated by our colleague, John Haig, from the Center for Business and Government, who also is a lecturer at the Kennedy School in Public Policy. So we thank them all for joining us and we warmly welcome them. We also hope you'll join us tomorrow at the JFK Jr. Forum, where we have two forums. The first at 4 o'clock, which is the annual Glauber Lecture, and we will welcome the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Eric Rosengren, will be in conversation with Professor Roger Porter of the Kennedy School. That's at 4 o'clock. And then at 6 o'clock, welcome back to the forum, where we welcome Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who will be in conversation with IOP fellow Brittany Packnett Cunningham about the election, about the civic engagement aspects of it, and the agenda for the next Congress. So a busy day tomorrow, but we're fortunate tonight to engage in this important conversation about technology and its impact today and for future generations with our extraordinary panel. So with my thanks to John for our collaboration for this evening, I'll turn the mic virtually over to you. Thank you, John.
I'm happy to accept the mic virtually. Mark, thank you very much. As Mark said, I'm John Haig, co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. One of the focus this evening is really on the tech industry, as Mark said, and it's specifically the digital social media platforms and their impact on society. And in the early days of the tech industry, there were grand hopes and grand beliefs and grand visions. And if you look at Facebook, I just, out of curiosity, dug up chronicle our lives and bring us together in unprecedented great ways of frictionless sharing, building communities. And when you look at Google, how can you forget, organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, and their corollary, do no evil. Now, we have with us tonight Jim, Ellen, and Shoshana. And Jim's organization, Common Sense Media, his nonprofit company, just came out with a new book. I'm gonna proselytize for the new book. It's called Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy in Our Lives. And Shoshana and Ellen both have chapters in the book. And so we're incredibly fortunate to have them here all with us tonight. But what Jim is doing with Common Sense in the book is also broader than just a book. It's a campaign, and I dug up some of his terminology, which I found interesting. And I will quote: "The purpose of the campaign is to hold big tech accountable for sowing mistrust and spreading misinformation, threatening free and open societies, exacerbating the gap between rich and poor, creating an unequal society, and leaving an entire segment of the population behind." Jim, I hope over the course of the evening you will tell us what you really think when you get to it. And then he appropriately kind of characterized this as that we're at a really critical and important inflection point. Will we continue, quote, "will we continue to trust big tech to make the world a better place? Or will we recognize that when an industry has unlimited capacity for good or evil, we must hold it accountable and not leave the most powerful companies on the face of the earth to their own devices? And I'm going to start, Jim, with you.
Okay.
How did we get here? And can you fill us in a little bit on the book and the campaign and the direction that you're taking Common Sense Media?
Sure. And John, thank you very much for having me. And Ellen and Shoshana, so fun to be here. And I just want to say to the audience that even though John is a Harvard professor, he had the wisdom to send his kid to Stanford with my child, because I'm a Stanford professor. So I always confess that in front of these loyal Harvard audiences.
Don't say that.
I hate to say that for you guys. Anyway, it's really interesting how we got here, because my life career is, I'm a child advocate. And when I started Common Sense Media in 2003, we were really trying to build the largest child advocacy group in the United States, which in fact we did do. And we didn't realize how incredibly impactful media and technology would be on kids' lives. We built our consumer platform that now has about 150 million users on it. And, as sort of a Trojan horse to get people to join the advocacy part of the work. And then in some ways, the media and technology platform overtook the advocacy platform in scale and size. And about 8 years ago, I'll tell you what really happened, because we were originally focused on most of the advocacy work we did, separate from our consumer and education work, was focused on movies, TV, video games, et cetera. I would say when I started Common Sense, Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers, but I think he was probably in about third grade. And the defining moment for me, it was interesting when you read the preamble, whatever Mark and Cheryl and those guys used to say about, they are Harvard graduates, I will acknowledge, used to say about frictionless sharing on Facebook. But I remember back in 2011, when I was writing my last book, Talking Back to Facebook, which did not go over well with Mark and Cheryl and their brethren at Facebook. What really struck me was that these social media platforms and some of the large internet companies that you mentioned were having this profound impact on the social, emotional, and cognitive development of children. And so I came out with that book 8 years ago. It created a fair story. And I will tell you, it changed our advocacy strategy, because it led to us taking on the issue of privacy, which I know as a con law professor is a huge fundamental right, but which in many cases, the internet companies, and Shoshana is the expert on this, had basically said privacy doesn't matter anymore. It's a social norm and we've moved on. And so over the past 5 or 6 years at Common Sense, I think we've recognized that we're at a pivotal moment in history, in American history and global history, where technology is colliding with our democracy. And we just saw that in this election with our fundamental approaches to education. We're seeing that during the COVID-19 pandemic, and clearly with its impact on our social, emotional, mental, and physical health. Actually, we work with all of the large technology companies. And so we don't only look at the downside. And Ellen, of course, was the CEO of an important technology company, Reddit, and has been a long time important player in the tech world. So Common Sense and the Steyer family, we are not anti-tech, but we do believe that the large tech companies have had this extraordinary impact on our lives, particularly those of kids and families and consumers, and that it's time for a fundamental shift in the way we view them. So let me very briefly lay out where I think that a broad agenda will go now that we have a Biden presidency, because I think that's a watershed moment where some of the extraordinary work that Shoshana has done, and she'll talk about, I'm sure, in a second, in terms of the concept of surveillance capitalism, will hopefully lead to a regulatory and legislative structure that can lead to a common sense approach to technology in all of our lives and from a regulatory standpoint. And so as we look at the landscape of technology 2020, number one, we saw this incredible impact on our election. So I think we're going to see significant efforts to rein in the impact, particularly of social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube on issues like the amplification and dissemination of hate speech, white supremacy, and misinformation and disinformation. Now that will take place politically in the context of a federal effort more than a California effort. And I'll explain California in a second, not just because I'm out here, but because we've been so important in legislation thus far. But I think it will lead to a fundamental reevaluation of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which essentially is a get out of jail free card, a blanket immunity provision for the major social media platforms, which is why they have not been held accountable for the misinformation, disinformation, hate speech amplification, et cetera. So one big issue that's going to be on the table that we'll hopefully talk about this evening is Section 230 and whether or not, not even whether or not, but how we should have common sense regulation of the large social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The second big issue that's clearly going to be on the table, and this was presaged before the recent election by Bill Barr and the Justice Department bringing an antitrust case against Google. So I do think we're going to see now major antitrust action brought against both Google and Facebook. We have worked with our colleague at Columbia, Tim Wu, who also has a chapter in Which Side of History, to frame the argument why Facebook should be forced to divest itself of WhatsApp and Instagram, and why the concentration in the tech industry in Facebook's case is not healthy for competition and leads to some of the downsides that Shoshana so superbly chronicled in her book. The third big issue that I think you're going to see come to the fore in even bigger terms than it has so far, but we've already led the way in this in California, is privacy. Privacy is a fundamental right in the United States. Back in 2018, Common Sense Media authored and sponsored the California Consumer Privacy Act, modeled after GDPR. We split the tech industry, which I would like to say is not monolithic. We went to the heads of Salesforce and Apple and Microsoft and HP, and they joined us in passing landmark privacy legislation in California in 2018 that is essentially the law of the land, not just in California, but for all states. And we also just passed last week Prop 24, which strengthened the California privacy law. And I think in 2021, with a Biden administration, I think you're going to see federal privacy legislation. It's been introduced before, but I actually think there's a reasonable chance of passage, despite the fact that the tech companies are the largest lobbying institutions in the history of corporate lobbying. And last but not least, the other issue that I think has to be on the table in this era of inequality is the issue of the digital divide. The fact that even during COVID-19, there are 16 or 17 million students in the United States who do not have either the adequate devices or connectivity to do Zoom classes like we're on right now. And so you have even more of a two-tiered education system. So I think we're at the precipice of fundamental changes in how technology impacts our lives, but also how we as a society regulate in a common sense way these major technology companies. And I'd be hard pressed to find two more knowledgeable or thoughtful people than Shoshana Zuboff and Ellen Pao to discuss this. So thank you very much for having me. I hope everybody runs out and buys a copy of Which Side of History. And you assign it in all your Harvard classes. And then let's have a great conversation. And thank you so much again, John, for having me.
You bet. I'm going to go to Ellen and then to Shoshana. And Ellen, in the chapter in the book, one of the things you start with is you talk about how big tech lost its purpose, and that a starting point should be a principle from the medical world, which was do no harm. And then you raise an intriguing question as well, and it kind of got me thinking this afternoon. How do we get back to wanting tech to be a benefit and actually make it one? And we'll start with that. I've got a few more questions for you, but we'll start with that one if you want to let us know what you think.
Yeah, there's a big part of me that thinks it's just like a whole different set of people, right? The people who are in there, they're now decabillionaires, centibillionaires. Like, it's just a different world. It's a place where they don't have to deal with people like you and me. I mean, they're in a different stratosphere, and the pandemic comes and they make twice as much money, right? All of a sudden their net worths are up by a fantastic amount while everybody else is struggling, everybody else is suffering. They don't understand the digital divide because they've got teams of people who are just dealing with their IT in their house, right? So it's just a different world. And I think that the piece that I struggle with is that they took such a homogeneous set of people to build all of these technologies, and they don't understand the problems that everybody else has, right? They don't understand the harassment that happens to women and people of color, and especially women of color. They don't understand that not everybody has broadband internet, so it's very hard to run classes and to take classes when you're struggling with poor internet connectivity. It's a world where they solve their own problems and they don't have the empathy or the capacity to actually understand other problems. And that's the piece where I would love to see these companies either change their whole executive teams or change out their CEOs, because they've shown that they don't care about a lot of the problems that we're dealing with, whether it's like taking the data and selling it into whoever will pay money for it, or dealing with the harassment and the abuse and the hate that has led to this offline set of horrible incidents, and it's continuing and it will continue to grow. The election doesn't change that. I think regulation will help, but when I was at Reddit, we got rid of revenge porn and we got rid of unauthorized nude photos, right? That was a small team of people just getting rid of it. And we got rid of, I think, all of it, right? In one day. Twitter followed, Facebook followed, YouTube followed, all of the big companies followed very quickly thereafter. It didn't take a lot of time for them. It wasn't like this year-long process. They didn't have to hire a giant team. Like, if you have the will, it will happen, and you can make it happen very quickly. I think the threat of regulation will force them to do a lot, and they can do it. They just choose not to. And when you change those incentives, hopefully it will push them to do the right thing. But it's not going to be based on their own values. It's going to be based on regulation pushing them, or the threat of regulation pushing them.
All right, that's interesting. So I want to go back, and I'm going to give Jim and Shoshana a heads up as well, because I'd love to hear your perspective on this next question. But Ellen, in an article in Wired a few years back, you said, let's stop pretending Facebook and Twitter CEOs can't fix this mess. CEO naivete is not a credible excuse for letting fake news and harassment flourish on your platform. And the question, I guess, I struggle with is, how much can we really expect some of these social media platforms to regulate themselves in any way, or change their behavior in any way? Or does it take a much stronger role from the government to step in? I'm going to throw that out to you now, and I'd love to hear Jim and Shoshana's perspective on how much can we really expect from these guys? And they're mostly guys. I hate to say it, but they're mostly guys.
They're all guys. YouTube is the one exception, but it's actually run under a guy. I wonder, like, we've seen so much progress in the last week as we've seen like the election unfolding. You've seen Twitter really start to take command of Donald Trump's account. You've seen Facebook do a little bit too. Like, it's all possible. It's all doable. It's just, how do you get the companies to do it? I wish it were, they can see like things are much better in the world and that motivates them, but it's not. I think it's it's going to be, perhaps it's like, repealing Section 230, which I actually don't think should apply anyway, based on the amount of activity and involvement they have with the content on their sites as it is. Right. I think it's kind of a red herring. I think they are liable today. But, so maybe it's that. I think it's like people suing for the harm that actually gets caused. So they have to internalize it instead of allowing it to be an externality that doesn't impact their revenues, doesn't impact their, contributes to the revenues and doesn't impact their, impact their bottom line. I think that's the piece. I'm like, I'm not anti-regulation. It's weird for me to be at the Kennedy School, because I don't believe that much in the ability of, like, the platforms are slightly complicated and it's hard to regulate from the outside. Like, it took me a long time to understand how Reddit works, to understand how the Reddit community works, to understand how, how people think in that organization, and the people who are actually going to make the changes have to be on board with the changes, where it's just going to be, this battle where like regulators come in, they make the minimal changes, then they leave, and then things devolve, and then, somebody has to take the hammer to them again. And it's like this constant catch up. But if you can get people to actually change like their systems and their structure. So they actually care that they're internalizing these costs, that people are actually forced to want these changes because it's impacting their performance reviews. It's impacting like every metric that they're measured on. Like that's where the change happens in a company. And it's hard to do that from the outside.
I would completely agree with that. Given my private sector background, I think if you don't change the incentives, you will not change the behavior, and can't expect that. It was 50 years ago, believe it or not, September 13th, 50 years ago, that Milton Friedman wrote his famous op-ed where he said the sole social responsibility of business was to generate basically profits for its shareholders within the rules of the game. And that has dominated MBA curriculums ever since. And I think you're starting to see a very fruitful discussion around the question of what is really the responsibility of a corporation in this context. So I want to ask you another question, Ellen, and then I'm going to switch over to Shoshana. You've had obviously some significant experience dealing with Silicon Valley and the lack of diversity and inclusion. Kind of what's your perspective and advice on kind of how to deal with the behavior, the kind of, in my view, unacceptable behavior? I have a daughter. I want the world to be open to her. And so what's your lessons learned, I guess, or what advice would you give us?
I think what we've seen in the past, several years with like the second wave of the Me Too movement, with a wave of litigation in tech, like these are systemic problems. So when you're faced with, an obstacle that you don't understand, when you're faced with, negative behavior directed to you, when you're not included in opportunities, when you're not included in, specific events, like to realize it's not actually you, right? You are not the problem. There's nothing you can do to change this behavior because it's a systemic problem, right? This is a system level problem. It's not between you and that one individual. And, if you push it up a level, that's not going to change things. It's a systemic problem. And you have to figure out, like, are there, ways that you can sustain yourself through that part of the system? Is there another part of the system that will be better for you? Is there a better company, or within your company, is there a better manager where you can work through it? Or is there another industry that you want to go to? Like, you have to figure out like what your tolerances of this type of behavior and where the opportunities are for you, and and how you want to deal with it. For every person, it's different. Like there's no blueprint to exactly how you manage it. It's what your personality is, what your level for conflict, what your aptitude for conflict is, and appetite for conflict is, and and where you're working and what industry you're in, what you want to do, and how you actually have opportunities. So it's hard. There's some people where they're trying to pay off student debt, right? They don't have opportunity to leave, or they're supporting their family members. They don't have the opportunity to just move. So you have to figure out, like, can I get something very specific out of this opportunity? Can I get 2 more skills that allow me to move into a higher level role where I'll have a little bit more control, or maybe to shift into a different industry or to a different function. And in that way, I can, have some specific goal for this job as I struggle and have not as many opportunities as I should, but it's a pathway to the next thing. And I know I have to stick with it for a while. So let me try to optimize it in the meantime. And I wanted to say one thing about kind of this idea of kind of corporate responsibility changing. Like it's cyclical. Like I got my MBA at Harvard in '98, and we had these conversations too. Like all of a sudden companies wanted to look at like the full corporate stakeholder that wasn't just their shareholders, but it's also their, physical local communities, it's their customers, it's their employees. And so like we're hitting back to that cycle where we're trying to expand the view, which has been too limited to shareholders. So it's interesting to see we don't learn, like we just keep going through the same cycle.
Hopefully we learn at some point. Shoshana, I'm going to turn to you, and then there's so much rich information here to talk about and discuss. But Shoshana, you wrote your chapter in the book on surveillance capitalism. You have your own book out on surveillance capitalism, which is massive, and I'm like about 80% of the way through it. But I would love to hear your perspective. Can you define for our audience what you mean by surveillance capitalism?
Well, let me backtrack a little bit. You know, I think the loop that we often get stuck in is, let me put it this way, we're receiving these harms all the time. You know, Jim's talking about disinformation and hate speech and incitement to violence. And we're right now where we're all just burned right now from these months and months of this violence that's being done to us. And so we want to say, yeah, let's regulate so that, you know, they can't do disinformation. We're going to get rid of 230, or we're going to change 230. We're going to, you know, we're not going to allow them to do this anymore. The problem is that won't work, because when we talk about disinformation, we're talking about a symptom, not a cause. So my effort has been to acknowledge the symptoms: disinformation, hate speech, psychological targeting, subliminal cueing, behavioral modification. All of these things are symptoms. And they're very real. You know, we've just learned so much about the Trump campaign in 2016 and how it very effectively suppressed the votes of Black citizens in those swing states, right? That's behavioral modification through the digital milieu, right? Straight up. Okay, so we've got symptoms, but what are the causes? What is the cause? And that's where the conversation about surveillance capitalism becomes so important, John, because using Occam's razor, does everybody know what Occam's razor is? As a graduate student at Harvard, I was always taught, you got to start with Occam's razor. You got to cut down, you know, to the simplest and tightest explanation of a phenomenon. And that's what helps you differentiate cause and effect. Occam's razor, slice right through. What we're talking about corporations, and we're talking about the economic logic that they have been able to develop and amplify, extend, deploy, and how that economic logic in record time has made them fabulously wealthy. That's where we start. Surveillance capitalism is an unusual economic logic. Is it capitalism? Absolutely. It follows the age-old pattern of capitalism, at least the centuries-old pattern of capitalism. The idea that you start out by, you know, you find things that live outside the market dynamic, you bring them into the market dynamic, you turn them into commodities that can be sold and purchased. That is the sort of big bang, you know, that starts a cycle of new capitalist accumulation. In the case of the companies that we're talking about, their huge breakthrough was that, you know, it's like the whole earth has been discovered, you know, so folks are going out to outer space. Well, in the economic world, everything has already been commoditized. I mean, what are we going to find when we get this new big bang? You know, the rivers are taken, the forests are taken, the meadows are taken. What are we going to find? What they found was private human experience, our personal experience. That's what became the new virgin wood. And what they figured out, and they did this in the heat of financial emergency. So forget about all that beautiful stuff they said about, you know, connection and, you know, the world's information. That is completely irrelevant, because it takes our attention away from what really happened. What really happened was they were afraid they were going to go bust. They were afraid their venture capitalists and the culture that Ellen has so well described were going to pull out. And so what they said was, to heck with our values, to heck with our principles, to heck with anything we ever said about this. we got to figure out how to really change advertising. And the only way we can do that is to leverage the personal information that we can extract from people's private experience. And by the way, if they know we're doing it, they're going to be really upset, and that's going to create friction. So we have to do it secretly. We don't tell them what we're doing. So the idea was personal experience becomes free raw material for these new processes of datafication. And those data run through supply chains. They run into factories called AI. Even back at the beginning in 2001, they were called AI. And what comes out of those factories are products. But these are products that predict our behavior based on all these information flows. And to predict our behavior, that turns out to be something super lucrative. Everybody wants to know. You're in business, John. Everybody wants to know, what will the future be? How do we predict our consumers' behavior or users' behavior? The first big prediction product was the click-through rate. That founded the new online advertising markets, which are built on targeting, right? Based on these huge flows of personal information that, when you think about it the way I've just described it, are fundamentally illegitimate. So this whole economic edifice and all the steps and processes in it are built on the fundamental illegitimacy of taking people's private experience without their knowledge, extracting it for datafication, and turning it into the processes of manufacturing and sales that I've described. So how did this happen? This happened because it was the year 2001, and that was also the year of the tragedies of 9/11. And a certain historical condition was created where our government suddenly became very aware of the need for total information awareness as the way that they were going to solve and cure what they felt was the huge failure of intelligence on that day. And to make a long story very short, the idea became these fledgling internet companies that were already monitoring and tracking with their web bugs and their cookies. Hey, instead of regulating them, instead of creating federal privacy legislation, which was the discussion on the table back then, let's give them wide berth, because we're going to need that human generated information that they produce. And that kicked off the story that allowed these companies to operate in essentially lawless space for 2 decades, going from tiny companies to surveillance empires, information behemoths that now operate based on these massive concentrations of knowledge. And as we've seen with targeting and the behavioral modification that targeting can bring, not only huge concentrations of knowledge, but the huge concentrations of power over people and our behavior and our attitudes. So we want to unravel these symptoms. These symptoms are destroying our democracy. We want to unravel these symptoms. We've got to go down to the ground floor, to the economic logic. And we've got to interrupt and outlaw the critical pieces of this economic logic so that we can clear the playing field. And we want to go back to, if we're having a renaissance of the stakeholder paradigm, which I truly hope is the case, but I think that the jury is still way out. But let's say we're going to move into a new cycle of how we think about, what is good capitalism. And part of that new cycle is, instead of an extractive operation, which is surveillance capitalism, we move to a form of a vision of a digital future where we're using data. We're using digital technology. We want all the data, but now we want the data to actually solve people's problems. Now we want the data to actually solve society's problems. Now we want the data to help, address the climate cataclysm and disease and cancer and all the rest. Right now, our AI capabilities, our data production capabilities are entirely concentrated in these corporations that have all the knowledge, but they use it. It's from us, but it's not for us. It's about us, but it's not to solve our problems. It's to direct to business customers in a new kind of market that trades exclusively in human futures, these predictions of what we're going to do. And these are markets that have these predictably pernicious outcomes that become the symptoms from which our society is now bending and near the breaking point under the burden.
So that's terrific. I have now like about 1,000 questions. I'll try to kind of keep it somewhat focused. I hear slightly different, not mutually exclusive, but slightly different perspectives on what needs to be done. And one of the things, we had a professor at the Kennedy School who did a terrific job of looking at the American Political Science Association review. And he looked at like 600 articles over the last decade. And the articles were phenomenal at describing what was happening and explaining what was happening. And out of some 600 articles, if I remember right, something like 5 of them then said, oh, therefore we should do X. So academics don't necessarily predict, but at the Kennedy School, we care about policy. We care about what are you going to do, right? And Jim, I heard, 4 kind of specific things that you think need to happen. Section 230 adjustment, antitrust action, more privacy like the CCPA in California, and dealing with the digital divide. Alan, I heard you kind of talk a little bit about, maybe a lot about the need to change the internal cultures and the norms within tech companies. And Shoshana, I heard you kind of describe a fundamental rethink that these are symptoms and that there's a fundamental rethink of capitalist systems, but I don't know where that takes me exactly in terms of like, what do I do differently tomorrow to bring this about? Do each of you want to kind of provide your perspective? And by the way, Shoshana, your prediction piece, you forgot to add the other 2 things that you put in your article, which is that enables you to target, and then you can exercise behavioral modification because you know how to pull the chains on people to make them do what you want them to do, which is even more frightening than simple prediction.
I did mention that.
Okay, well, that seems to me to be a pretty important part of what you're trying to explain. So anybody want to comment on this whole notion of what's the right thing to do at this point in time, beyond what you've said already?
Sure, here's what I'd say, and this is to really follow on both what Ellen and Shoshana said. First of all, you did pose the question to us, first to Ellen, but in general, will these guys self-regulate? The answer is no, they will not. They're not going to self-regulate on the best interests of society alone. That said, Ellen is absolutely correct that you can go after both the leadership and the employees to change their behavior. And they could have changed many of the biggest companies could have changed their behavior. So I think you clearly have to have major common sense regulation and legislation. They will not do this themselves, period, full stop. Second, we've run this campaign called Stop Hate for Profit, which is it started as an advertising boycott of Facebook and has morphed into a much broader critique of Facebook and Instagram for their impact on democracy. That's a shaming exercise largely. There's a market play that Shoshana would approve of, but essentially Facebook said it was too big to be regulated by the advertisers. They said they'll have to come back to us. So I think there is a major element where you have to impact both the leadership and the employees of the company. And the employees should not be left out. And I will assure you that at Common Sense and our colleagues now, we are going after the employees of some of the companies saying, do you want to be part of a company that undermines democracy? So I think third, you have to have the public gain a level of understanding. They're so much more knowledgeable today than they were 5 years ago to basically push for systemic change that Shoshana is referring to. So I think you're going to, number one, they're never going to do it on their own, but you need really systemic regulation and legislation. You need real pressure on the leadership and the employees. And then you need the public saying, we want to shift the model. I think all those three things have to happen. And I am actually optimistic that all of those are moving in the right direction.
Helen, do you want to weigh in on the piece that Jim was talking about? Because I know you had, I'm trying to figure out the mechanism by which we potentially change some of the executives, particularly when Mark Zuckerberg has complete and utter controlling interest of Facebook shares.
Yeah, I mean, there are pieces that you can regulate, but I think it is systemic. It's like you need to make sure that you're taking into account the harm to the consumer, right? The harm to the customer has to be part of the calculation. The harm to the communities has to be part of the calculation. And we have to get that back into how companies govern themselves and how board members judge the performance. And that piece has been, it goes up and down, but it really doesn't seem to be part of what's going on today. And that's part of what Shauna's saying. Like, we can't be focused just on the profits. We need to look at how everybody is working. And I think it is happening. Like, employees are, going after Amazon, they're going after Microsoft, they're going after Salesforce, they're going after Facebook, they're going after Palantir. They got Palantir to move out of Palo Alto. They got Jewel to move out of San Francisco, right? It's, like, the communities are coming after the employees, and the employees are going after the leaders, and changes are happening. When I started Project Include, we focused on getting CEOs to change. I didn't think you could get employees to change. They're making so much money. They had like every need taken care of. They came straight out of college and went into this, cult-like environment where all they did was make friends at these companies they worked at. They took care of their food. It took care of their dental appointments. It took care of their haircuts, their laundry. Everything was kind of at that one location, and they didn't want to leave because it was all they knew. And I think now people are starting to go back to values. I think this next generation of employee who's coming into the workforce, we saw it at the polls, like these 18 to 29-year-olds, they're much more progressive. They don't want to work at a company that doesn't share their values. They want to see their company leaders actually act on their values and not just on, talk about their values. And they're trying to hold people accountable. And I think you see the press kind of being more interested in those stories and giving coverage that actually gets the CEOs to move, right? When they see that the public perception, because of coverage of what their employees are saying and doing, is negative, they will make the move. But I think it has to be more than that, because you see them, do the minimal to get through that press run, and then they go right back to the bad behavior until something else spikes in the press. So that, it's got to be the systemic change where you really force them to internalize the costs and the harm that they're causing, so that hopefully they do no harm. Hopefully they get to the point where they're taking account of all the harm, and it stops being this, how do I make the most money with the minimal cost?
So I have to confess that I'm a applied economist. Don't hold me at fault for that. And the general notion that these, somebody described the original sin of businesses that if they can externalize their costs, they will. And if you don't find a way to make them internalize those costs, they will never deal with it. So I actually believe that. Shoshana, you want to have the last comment word before we switch over to Q&A here shortly?
Well, look, there's nothing more important right now than law, and the idea, we have blown way past any conversations about self-regulation and ethics and values and, being good Americans or whatever. We've been talking about self-regulation since 1996. This, just rest in peace. This is over. This, we're talking about now, we're entering the third decade of the digital century, and we don't have the basic laws that we need in order to avert all of the symptoms that we're talking about. This is like going through the 20th century without child labor law, or without the right to join a union or to strike or to bargain collectively, or without any kind of consumer rights to safe food and medicine and rights to clean air and safe banking practices. all of that creative lawmaking and institution building, which defined the third and fourth decades of the 20th century and allowed that century to be a relatively democratic century, relatively equal century for quite a few decades, still in the face of, powerful industrial capitalism. We have none of that. We are marching naked into this digital future with absolutely no protection, right? And that really is not an overstatement. So the first thing, we need to say is, what is disinformation? Because right now, disinformation has taken the apparatus of surveillance capitalism, the targeting, the subliminal cues, the behavior modification, the engineered social comparison dynamics, all of that, and pivoted it to political behavior and political attitudes. And this is destroying the social compact. We simply, from Orwell onward, we have understood that this kind of thing destroys democracy. But disinformation in the context of surveillance capitalism is merely a mechanism for economies of scale. To make all this stuff work really well, you need a lot of data. And to get a lot of data, you need a lot of engagement. And so the disinformation, the hate, the violence, they draw a lot of engagement. They drive the supply chains. So we have to be looking this way. Now, in my view, we have, going back to Occam's razor, we have two really strong candidates for how we regulate, how we intervene in the economic process. One is at the supply end and one is at the demand end. At the supply end, the idea that we have companies that can just take my face and squeeze all the data from my face and use it to secretly predict my behavior for these downstream processes of targeting, et cetera, that's fundamentally illegitimate. That's intolerable. I should decide who takes my face if my face is datafied and all the other downstream processes that go with that. So this is why I write about rights, what I call epistemic rights, the rights to know. Who gets to know about my face? Who gets to know about my feelings from the micro expressions in my face? Who gets to decide if that becomes data? And who gets to decide how those data are used? Those rights have always been my rights and your rights because they've never been challenged. Just like I have the right to sit down and I have the right to stand up. It's my right. It's elemental. It's natural. No one is challenging it. It's only at that moment in the development of society when a natural right becomes challenged that you have to switch from it being just natural to something codified in law. And thanks to surveillance capitalism, we are at that point where these kinds of rights need to be codified in law. That's the supply side. If you give rights back to sovereign individuals, you interrupt supply and you throw the whole thing up for grabs. So do I want to share my data with Facebook? No. Do I want to share my data with Ellen's company that's going to figure out how to cure cancer, the kind of cancer that my mother and my grandmother had? Absolutely. That's how we change supply. On the demand side, we interrupt those markets that trade exclusively in human futures. The idea that they can gather these unprecedented concentrations of knowledge in order to predict what individuals, groups, and populations will do in order to monetize that knowledge. This is what is leading predictably to the targeting, the disinformation, the hate, the violence, the manipulation, the behavioral modification. All of those things are thrown out of the competitive dynamics of this specific kind of marketplace. In my
Shoshana, I
view,
apologize. I'm going to have to. One of the rules of the forum is that all of us have to take unfiltered questions from students and others. And I need to leave them a little bit I apologize. I
Bring it
need
on.
to leave them a little bit of time to do that. And I'm going to remind all of our people providing questions, you got to identify yourself and provide your university affiliation. Try to keep it to a reasonably brief question per person. No speeches, please. Questions end with a question mark. Please try to ask a question. That's where we are. So the first up is Anand, I think from the college. And Kathy, are you helping Anand? Oh, there he is. Anand, you're up.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Anand, and I'm a junior at the college. Before I start, I want to say, Professor Steyer, my sister is a student in one of your classes right now, so she's really rubbing this in my face. And I guess my question is, from a legal perspective, law enforcement has always been able to use the data we provide to law enforcement platforms using the third-party doctrine in the Fourth Amendment, under the assumption that we freely share all that information and data to those platforms, so they don't need a warrant to access all that information. With the huge movement to work from home, and for me, being a student from home, and all the online platforms I have to rely on and need for my everyday life, do you see that third-party doctrine changing to fit online providers?
I would definitely say so. I bet you're going to say yes, Shoshana. I'm a former prosecutor, by the way. Absolutely, I think you're going to have to take that into account. And I think they're going to have to amend, just like we did the fundamental privacy law in California, by the way, that it will apply to police enforcement and other forms of government surveillance. But yes, I absolutely think they're going to have to reimagine those laws because of that, just like they did normal Fourth Amendment search and seizure law, which as a prosecutor I had to deal with all the time, but that was pre all of this. But yeah, I think they're going to do it for sure. Shoshana and Ellen? Yeah, I think so.
Shoshana, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're on. Try again.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call if someone wasn't accidentally muted.
I don't see a mute button on the screen, so I'm not sure what happened. Ellen, do you want to comment? I may have a comment here or two, but go ahead. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think it's changing. When I was at Reddit like 5 years ago, the law enforcement didn't really understand the platforms. So we would get warrants, and usually there'd be a problem with it. So we could just say, no, this is not a valid request, and we would push back on all the requests. If there weren't that many requests, we could push back. Sometimes we have to share information. We'd let the user know. We didn't keep that much information. It was very privacy oriented back then. So I think now the law has to catch up. So this is the first time where there are, where you can start getting information, and where, where the institutions actually understand to ask, and that they can get a lot of information. A lot of times the requests were very, like they weren't getting any useful information anyway, right? Like they would ask for stuff, we wouldn't have it. They would, they didn't know what to ask for. And now now they're getting smarter. They know what to ask for, and they can get a ton of really private information. So I do think that things will have to catch up, and I hope it's sooner rather than later, because the information that you can get from a company like Instagram or Facebook, I mean, it's huge.
Can you hear me now?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, I just building on that, I was going to say that that the doctrine is already flawed because it's based on a misconception. And the misconception is that the information that the platform has about me is the information that I have knowingly given. But that is fundamentally untrue. The information that the platform has about me, only a small fraction of that is what I have knowingly given. Most of the information is what I call behavioral surplus. It's what has been extracted from their ability to interface with any of my traces, my walk in the park. It's not just that I'm walking from, Main Street to Grand Street. It's the stoop of my shoulders. It's my gait. It's my pace. It's not just what I say. It's the cadence of my speech. It's not my post. It's whether I use exclamation marks or bullet points. These are just simple examples of behavioral surplus. So these are the signals, the predictive signals that are constantly being lifted from every aspect of our experience. That's why I talk about face, because micro expressions are hugely rich with predictive signals. So what the platforms have is massive. When Facebook says we ingest trillions of data points every day in our AI hub and predicts 6 million predictions per second, a tiny bit of that is recognizable as something I knowingly shared with some company because I thought it was a reasonable trade-off. So boom, we're rebuilding search and seizure, Anand. We're rebuilding the Fourth Amendment for a new century. That's the bottom line.
So I'm going to show my own biases here. I've tried to be an objective moderator of this discussion, but there is an important kind of corollary to what you're talking about, and that is the kind of regulatory processes, the legislative processes. And I happen to believe there's something in a first mover advantage. And so, for example, if you think about what the EU has done with GDPR, it was a predecessor to what California did with CCPA, and that starts to define the landscape. And if you look at the way these technologies are structured, there's a strong bias towards single platforms that support across countries. Microsoft does not want to create multiple platforms. So they would like a uniform standard that is actually more of a global standard, which is a whole different, we could spend another whole session talking about global governance of tech, but I think it's laws at the micro level, but it's laws at the broader level and standards at the broader level as well. Jasmine, I think you are the next one up. Do we have Jasmine?
Hi there. Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you.
Awesome. Here we go. Start my video. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Jasmine. I'm a senior at the college. I'm the vice president of the Institute of Politics. I'm super happy to have you. My question was related to some of the things that you guys mentioned regarding impact and what we can do about what's going on. You guys have spoken to mostly legislative things that have to do with policy, changing policy, advocating for policy. But obviously those demographics tend to be a little bit different than those who are really inundated with the tech world. And, you know, we're really well versed in it, but we're not necessarily in a position to change those policies that really govern tech companies, if we are to even agree that tech companies are governed at all. So with that, I wanted to ask what you guys, or how you guys would define pressure by young people who want to see a change. And, you know, I say that with the thought that it's, you know, in light of the protests that we've seen recently that have been really great and have been successful for my generation, it's not necessarily something we can do in the tech world because that closes our own access to the benefits that these platforms also provide us, which includes like Google, really, if you need to do your homework, or Facebook, if you need to sell things, you know, that can really impact, especially communities of color and low-income communities. So with that, I'd ask what young people like me can do who are not necessarily a congressperson, maybe yet, but really care about seeing change here.
Organize and speak out, and don't be afraid. You guys have huge power. Look, with that stuff we're doing around Stop Hate for Profit, right, which has been very successful against Facebook and Instagram. It really is. There's an element to it, which is an advertiser boycott. There's an element to it as a celebrity-driven thing, because those guys are huge influencers and live on those platforms. But the other piece is young people. I mean, look, if your generation hadn't voted this time, Jazz, we would still have your hero, Donald Trump, in the White House. So this is a lot. I say this to my Stanford students all the time. You have huge voice. I grew up at a time when students knew we could change the world and did change the world. You can too. If Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok had a group of, I love it when you call it the college, but anyway, all of you people from the college, bless you all Harvardites. If you organize just Harvard students to go after one of those companies, particularly Instagram or Snapchat where you all live, and they know you do, would have a huge impact, particularly if you were talking about racial justice or other stuff that you didn't like on the platform. I think you have incredible power, but you have to organize. It can't just be one individual voice unless you're Kim Kardashian, God forbid. But although she matters and she's been helpful to us, But I think if you organize, young people have an incredible voice, and you'll impact the employees too, because the employees aren't that much older than you. And therefore, but you got to organize and you got to be powerful and you can't be afraid. That would be my quick statement.
Shoshana or Ellen, you want to add anything, or are you good?
Well, look, Jasmine, the question that you're asking, this is everything, right? So I'm looking at data, and the really good data, really comprehensive, big survey data just from the last few months. And what the data already show are a wholesale rupture. And it cuts actually across, interestingly enough, every generation, you know, from the 18-year-olds to the 70-year-olds, a wholesale rupture of faith between the American public and these companies and these processes that we've been discussing. So we've broken through some of that basic public education stuff. Public opinion is on the move, and young people are a critical part of this. In my work over the last year and a half, since I've been traveling around talking before pandemic, shut everything down, my audiences were mostly young people. Young people all over the world are really, really upset about this. So the first thing is, it's collective action, Jasmine. And there are so many ways to, and folks in your generation aren't used to thinking about collective action. Like I was, very involved in the Divest Harvard movement. And it took a lot for the college students to get their minds around collective action. It had been a long time, but you've got things happening right on campus. You've got platforms that you are using on campus that are surveillance capitalism-based platforms for your work and your assignments. And I'm reading an article this morning about how some of the stuff that people are using for remote education are actually tracking eye movements when you're taking a test or when you're attending a class, to see if you're engaged, if you're paying attention, and you're being graded on the angle of the gaze of your eyes. All the stuff that we're talking about, there are aspects of it that are being institutionalized in your daily lives right on campus. That is a great place to start, to organize, create a collective, create a movement right on campus. Start with your friends and say, this is intolerable, and this is a microcosm of the larger problem that's happening in our country and in our civilization. And this is not going to be the future that we choose. You can start anywhere and pull that thread, and it gets to everything. You see what I mean?
Helen, do you want to add anything? Last comment?
Yeah.
The last comment.
All right. I do think, like, when I look around, I think your generation is going to be, like, that's my hope. When I go and I talk to schools, and the kids are so much more progressive and they understand these issues. And when I was your age, I had no idea about systemic racism, about systemic discrimination, about any of these issues. And I think, the fact that you're asking these questions, you're like much more advanced than a lot of us were at your age, and at your love, in college. I think it's interesting. Like, I think you also have this power to boycott them as employers, right? They are dying to get talent. The founders of Facebook were all from Harvard. And if they couldn't recruit from Harvard, that would change their behavior. If they couldn't recruit for, and also to pull other schools into it. I don't know if you've been following, the Black students at these independent schools, in independent high schools, and their movement to educate other students, to educate their administrators. And, they're working together, and they share information on Instagram. They're supporting each other through social media. Like, if you can get like that level where it's like, starts with your local group, but then it expands, as Shoshana said, like you pull that rope and people are interested and it just grows, that can be really impactful. And the fact that you have social media, which we did not have, it can be incredibly powerful. It's a totally different generation. You have different tools. They can't fight it because none of them are really using it in an impact, using their own tools in an impactful way. And for that to be on their platform and for them not to be able to hire and for them to have this negative press where people are taking collective action from an institution like Harvard can be very powerful. And if you're also asking for them to, for your administrators to divest from investing in these companies, like that's attacking them from many different angles that, they have to address. I would also write to the board members. Like they're kind of sheltered and they don't hear from people and they don't hear from, people who don't look like them. And if they could hear your stories, if they could hear that this is real and it's not something that that the leadership team of these companies are saying that they're taking care of, if all of a sudden it's on their desk, it's a different experience.
So I'm going to make one last comment to you, Jasmine, and that really has to do with, I'm going to try to connect a couple dots around some of the earlier discussion about corporate social responsibility that we were having. If you think about playing into the incentives that exist within those corporations, as Ellen was talking about, and then you think about stakeholder capitalism and thinking more broadly across stakeholders, well, that's in the interest of the company if the voices are powerful enough and strong enough and clear enough. And I'll give you a specific example, even though it's an employee example. When the employees of Google were not happy about Project Maven and the support that Google was providing on a Defense Department contract, Sundar Pichai chose to go with his employees. Now, I don't know if he would have chosen that if they hadn't been so forceful, but the point is that basically when you start to think about, a good businessman thinks broadly across their stakeholders, and you don't want the stakeholder label to become a mechanism, because when you're accountable to everyone, you're accountable to no one. But if it's meaningful in the sense of employees expressing a view or customers expressing a view and using your voice, you can have much more impact, as all the panelists have said, than you can imagine. With that, we've run over by 7 minutes. My apologies. I'm a horrible moderator. I can't keep things on track. I try, but I just want to say thanks to everybody. First of all, thanks to our panelists, Shoshana, Ellen, Jim. It was a fantastic job. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time with us tonight. And thanks to all of the Institute of Politics people and Mark Gearan for helping make this happen. And enjoy the rest of your evening. Lots of food for thought, I hope.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.